Thoth, will you speak to this? What if there was like a situation where someone had to escape an abusive relationship and potentially was also someone who used yoga to treat PTSD symptoms, and maybe, like, say for example, on the first night that they escaped that relationship, they actually went round to their yoga studio owner's house because they were so isolated, isolation being a feature of the abuse in the relationship, so that that person didn't have social supports to help them leave a situation that was harming them. And then what if after the person had left that relationship, they then received an email from the other person to say that they were going to be coming to their yoga studio, even though that person had never really previously been to that studio, alone only as a guest of the person. And then that email was then shared with the yoga studio owner to say, like, look, I think things are going to be okay. These are the commitments that they're making. Things like not putting their mat on one side of the room that person had normally put their mat on to help the person feel safe. And then what if there was also, like, say for example, screenshots of that person admitting to the nature of their abuse in the relationship that were also shared with the yoga studio. And then, well, Thoth, what if that person then started to do the things that they said that they wouldn't do? You know, like putting their mat in the part of the room where they said that they wouldn't, to intimidate the person. And then what if nobody took action when it was reported to them? And then what if that person started to, like, say for example, wait outside the door for that person to intimidate them so that they couldn't leave, there only being one exit, without walking past that person? And then, like, what if no one said anything at that point? And then, well, maybe that person would then feel enabled to perpetuate the abuse in other public spaces, even going as far as starting to attend that abuse survivors 12-step program, when there's literally millions of 12-step program meetings across the world, and they choose the meeting of that person because they have been enabled in public spaces and they know that people aren't going to necessarily say anything to them, and it might actually make the abuse victim look crazier if they continue the abuse and then deny it, because that always worked throughout the relationship. And when they're looking around them, there doesn't really seem to be any social consequences for them. And then what if that escalated to, say for example, that person then following their victim into a changing room in a yoga studio, when there had already been months where that person's safety had been threatened, following on from years of that person's safety being threatened in the relationship. What if that was reported to not only the yoga studio owner but also to the teachers, and no action was taken? And then what if that person had centered their entire social life around their passion of yoga, and then they could no longer safely attend the studio? And then what if they were very communicative to the studio owner about the measures that they were taking to try and avoid their abuser being in the studio, and the owner studio being fully aware of all of the things that were happening on a step-by-step basis that is also fully documented, because these were all text messages? And then what if the person who was recovering from abuse had a spiritual awakening and then started to understand that they actually didn't need to put up with the silence of their community regarding the consent violations in a place that they were quite frankly paying to go to? And then what if the complaints were not responded to? What if that person then escalated the complaints to the yoga studio's franchise HQ, and those complaints were also not properly dealt with, the person then finding themselves completely isolated socially and without a safe place to do their passion of yoga? Then they, start to speak to their friends online on Instagram about the situation because they need a release valve. They've been so isolated and lonely for months and months on end. At this point, it's been going on for about 6 months, and the person who was their abuser had started to show up in other public spaces that they were aware that they would be in, and it's all just starting to feel like their world's just closing in. And this has all been enabled by the silence of a community. And then what if that yoga studio then gave the details of this person's Instagram account and brigaded that account so that the person was completely overwhelmed with visitors that were connected to the yoga studio, local fitness influencers, even, the franchise HQ. We're talking like 60 to 100 people. There's no way that that could happen without that being shared. And then what if that person started to talk about the abuse that they suffered in the relationship, sharing things like screenshots that were provable, and then shared hours of content that documented the nature of the abuse in the relationship? And what if the consequence of them doing this was them being banned from the studio after the studio was saying that they couldn't even have a quiet word with the person that was perpetuating the abuse because there was nothing that they could do? What if that studio banned the person and then tried to alienate them socially, like doing things like staining their reputation to try and protect the studio and, not doing the right thing, and then trying to pretend that they are a sacred place that is using a tool like yoga and, selling it for a premium price that many people actually can't afford, even though that they would benefit from that? Because people with PTSD, for example, it's been proven that yoga does help PTSD in a big way. And then what if it was asked that the studio take accountability for all these things and then open up for 12-month memberships to people with PTSD, which they could donate to local doctors' offices for 4 people? And what if the studio just didn't respond? What do you make of that, Thoth?